in finding and a way to establish an independent Jewish state. Didn't know how to phrase that, but the thing is that ever since the exodus from Egypt, and having had an initial kingdom in Israel, which took hundreds of years to have that happen, and experiencing an initial Gullus, the first one after the destruction of the first temple, there has been a constant theme of having an independent Jewish nation, a commonwealth established in the land of Israel as we know it, for millennia. And it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle because in many ways it's tied to the commandments themselves. It's related to how well we commit ourselves to that practice and how well we treat each other in the land. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly what would set Yom Haatzmaut apart from the rest of the experiences we've had historic as a people, but in a lot of ways there is a significant similarity to it. So I want to start off by talking about the idea of establishing a holiday to commemorate an experience in the Jewish calendar. And then I want to talk a little bit about Yom Haatzmaut in that framework. So let's ignore Yom Haatzmaut for a second. Let's just look at the idea of establishing holidays. So the Gemara in Megillah kind of asks the question about how is Purim turned into a holiday anyway? So how do you even get that to be a holiday? So first of all, number one, during the Second Temple period, there was a number of days that were set up to be holidays. And we wrote a book called Megillas Ta'anis. There's a book called The Scroll of Fasts that kept track of when these festival days were, so that we wouldn't fast on those days. You wouldn't fast on those days, and you wouldn't say eulogies, and they were special days. And we kept distance between when we would have experiences of mourning and when we would have experiences of joyfulness. It's not like that didn't exist previously. When King Solomon builds the temple, there's a big celebration that's recorded in chapters 8 through 10 of the Book of Kings, the first Book of Kings. And we find that the Maccabees do a similar thing when they rescue the Second Temple from the hands of Menelaus and the Seleucid Empire and restore observance. But the Gemara in Megillah asks a really important question. How is it possible to be rescued from such a calamity and not create song for that? So what's the Gemara itself even asking? Well, the commentaries are kind of quiet, but in the context of Jewish experience, if you compare it to other Gemaras elsewhere, we find that the Jewish people commemorated the song at the sea. Oh, one second. The question over here, I didn't see that. The question over here is, my uncle in Indonesia, and okay. All right, that was more of a comment than not a question. Or was I saying? Oh, yes. So the main focus was, how is it that you could have this experience and not wish to compose songs on the greatness of the experience? So in the Exodus from Egypt, they composed a song of the sea. But it was tempered a little bit because God was not happy with the experience of losing so many people to the experience of the sea, meaning the Egyptians went and pursued the Jewish people into the Sea of Reeds, and it was very tumultuous and lost a lot of people. So we therefore don't finish the full Hallel on those days. And what's Hallel? Hallel is the Jewish example, the preeminent format for reciting songs, more so than the song at the sea. Let me look at your comment over here. Next comment was, okay, another stupid comment. So the main focus of the song at the sea was to celebrate the redemption. So in many ways, experiencing redemption was the main point of reciting the songs. And so the Gemara in Megillah basically states that that you should recite songs. So the Gemara says, okay, but if this event of Purim didn't happen in the land of Israel, it happened elsewhere. So the Gemara goes, oh, I guess you don't say Hallel then, right? Then Rava retorts back, you do recite a song. The Megillah is in the place of Hallel. And that's kind of the statement of the Gemara. It's a pithy little statement, but it's very important. It's filled with a lot of meaning. And that meaning basically is that the experience of redemption is one of a lot of joy and gladness at our redemption itself. But we also can't feel it fully unless we really experience it in the land of Israel itself. So then the question is, do we need to continually establish holidays for these events? So the Megillah's Tainus came to an end with the closing of the Second Temple period, but only 2 holidays were retained from the Second Temple period, Purim and Hanukkah. So then the question comes, well, do we establish any more holidays after that? So that debate is kind of quiet for a long time. No one really talks about it for quite a long time. And so what they basically discuss is whether or not one is permitted to establish a new holiday when you experience something good. So this dispute is actually mentioned in the 16th century. So it's even a dispute that goes after the time of the Shulchan Aruch. And it's the dispute between 2 people who are not contemporaneous with each other. There's Moshe Alshaker, who lived in Jerusalem, who was one of the early Kabbalists, who lived right around the same time as the great Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak, and also Moshe Cordovero. And he writes in his book, in number 49, he says that we do establish new holidays. However, Rav Chaim de Silva, who's the author of the Sefer Pri Chadash, disagrees. He says no. When they got done using holidays with the Megillah's Tainus, we can't make any more. He says we can't make any more holidays. So both of these opinions are actually, again, they're kind of mentioned. The opinion of the Maharam Alshaker seems to be preferred in some Ashkenazi commentaries like the Magen Avraham and so on. But the actual issue itself about whether or not you can establish new holidays, it takes a really long time for someone to really look at the idea of doing it again. It had been done, but the question was, what was the halachic basis for it? So the first time there's another serious discussion about it is in the Tshuvas Chassam Sofer. I mentioned this in a short. And the Chassam Sofer was asked about the holidays in Meron in Israel around Lag BaOmer. And he kind of mentions he's not sure why it is that people would establish a holiday for a yard site. We don't have a holiday on someone's day of their passing. And it was the anniversary of the passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, according to what they were saying. He was taking everything he said as 100%. So it's odd. But let's kind of move past that. Let's see if we could go ahead and establish this as a holiday. He says, so first of all, I know we always were establishing holidays. He said, when I lived in Frankfurt, the Main, because the Chassam Sofer was the chief rabbi of Pressburg, which was closer to modern-day Hungary, as opposed to Frankfurt, which is still Frankfurt, on the Main River in Germany. And in those cases, he said, we still have those holidays. He said, I even celebrate that holiday. It was known as Frankfurt Purim, or Purim de Frankfurt the Main, is how he refers to it in Yiddish. And it was basically the 20th of Adar, and they were saved from a calamity. He says that we still celebrate that day. And he's not the only one. A contemporary of his lived a little bit later, the Chai Adam of Avram Danzig. He writes, oh yeah, we used to have holidays all the time. And he writes this at the end of Hilchos Megillah in Purim in 155, the end of the Sefer of Chai Adam, all these festival days that were being enacted. So they had all kinds of festival days. And the truth is that this issue gets kind of quiet after that. So we know people were establishing holidays. So then the question came up when they were establishing the state of Israel as to whether or not when they did finally declare independence, whether or not that should be a holiday. So of course there was two major contributing factors to whether or not it should be a holiday. The number one issue was whether or not this was really a holiday. It's a secular government. It's not the same thing as all the other holidays. Those had religious bases to them. This was not religiously motivated. That is probably the chief number one Haredi answer to that. But on a very basic level, a very simple question basically was declaring independence the actual way in which the Jews established their other holidays? Do they establish holidays that way? I am free from tyranny. I'm gonna have something to eat. So that's like the common Jewish joke, right? The guy tried to kill us. God saved us. Let's eat. So is that really the formula? Well, if you look at the Megillah, clearly at the end of it, they talk about v'noach me'oivehem. They rest from their enemies on the 14th of Adar and on the 15th of Adar. But while they're fighting, they don't declare that to be the holiday, but they commemorate resting from it. So it would seem that would make sense not to have the holiday on those days when the fighting would continue. And declaring independence was just the beginning of it. The immediately after the Declaration of Independence, Jordan moved in and took large sections of the old city, killed a number of the residents of the old city of Jerusalem. The Arab nation started moving in. Israel had to amass its forces to defend itself, and it was very tumultuous. It was not a day of rest after the fact. So if you look at Purim, you'd have a very tight argument. They didn't. That's not when they did it. It says clearly that it was on the days when they rested. So let's look at Hanukkah. So Hanukkah, a bunch of religious zealots known as the Maccabees came in and reclaimed the temple and cleaned it up from Menelaus and from the Seleucids. Now the Seleucids and Menelaus, at first, initially, the reason why they got support to have the revolt in Judea was because the Jews, meaning the Maccabees themselves, were Kohanim, so they were the priestly class, but they had popular support as well, because when the previous Kohen, known as Jason, was being replaced by Menelaus, and again you had to buy, as the Gemara says in Yuma. In those days, the Kohen Gadol position was for sale. Menelaus bought it. He's like, I want to introduce pagan practices. So they cleaned that all up. Now, what's funny is if you look in Josephus's discussion about antiquities, and say a little more about the history in general, the revolt was super popular when it was just to clean up the temple. It loses its support a little bit when like, oh, you want us to be an independent nation now? So 163, 164, and 160, those years where they're fighting back to take the temple back, was one thing. And so, but that went from a religious experience to then a national revolt, which took another 20 years to finally push back the Seleucids, because the Maccabees had a small plan, which was just to retake the temple. But then it became like, well, in order for you to maintain this, you have to push the Seleucids out completely. And so then they went from being a small band of rebels to a very large and organized political system. And Yehuda Maccabee didn't even live to see the fulfillment of all of that behavior. It went to his brother. So if you look at Hanukkah, the establishment of Hanukkah was specifically related to the religious freedom and the establishment of the temple sacrifice in the proper way, and not for the political experience itself, which came much, much later and doesn't have anything to commemorate it, honestly. So Yom Haatzmaut, in a sense, is different than those cases. It's different. So you can see that the holidays themselves have a very religious nature to them. So then the question is, then why would you establish a holiday for Yom Haatzmaut if it's not a purely religious experience? But the thing is that it became much more of an essential part of the Jewish experience, because there was nowhere for the Jews to go in the wake of World War II. they clearly were not welcome in Europe anymore. And so, in a sense, it became it became more like Purim in the sense that they had to find a place wherein they were able to survive going forward. And the state of Israel seemed like the only viable platform going there. And it's not like it popped out of nowhere. They were promised the land of Israel to be returned to them after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. As with everything British, it took them forever to finally just hand it over and not have to be in control of it. Because we see what a great job Britain does in ruling its own island nowadays. Clearly, all that wisdom was applied very, very well to the Mandate period. And clearly they were super, super necessary in keeping a lot of those things. And in fact, many of the problems in Israel's judiciary system today stem from the fact that they've kept on some of these British Mandate time periods and haven't been able to get rid of them fast enough. So it became a necessary step in creating a safe place for all Jews to come to. Because in 1950, the law of return was created and allowed all Jews free and easy access to the land of Israel just because they were Jews. However, these things weren't in line with the halakha. So it's not an easy thing to say. However, when one reads the material from the Rabbanim at the time, from Rav Herzog, he when he was chief rabbi, he supported the idea of having the holiday, and he talks about the great revival of the state itself and how necessary and important it was. But the truly religious fervor is really captured by Rabbi Menachem Ra'ata in his Tshuvos, and he really says that this is the beginning of something much greater than anything we've experienced in a long time, and that sentiment is echoed through a number of different opinions. So how do we turn Yom Haatzmaut into a holiday? And so what we lack is a Sanhedrin, which we had at the times of Purim and of Hanukkah. The Sanhedrin was recognized 100% as the pure final core of decision for the Jewish people. We do not have or do not enjoy that type of central experience anymore. So there was a big dispute amongst the rabbis of the time period in the 1950s about whether or not you would have a holiday in which you would recite Hallel for it when it came to Yom Haatzmaut. So the question was having the chief rabbinate enough to establish a new day that's for celebration. So that's basically the halakhic dispute, and it's pretty clear. So there's a couple of things over here. So in the Tshuvos of Mar Habazek, which are some of the questions that go through the chief rabbinate, they themselves say that in year 5709, I've said 5708, I guess I got my math wrong. They wanted to declare Yom Haatzmaut. Okay. So what they did was at the time, which was Rav Uziel and Rav Herzog. So Rav Uziel was the head of the IDF rabbinate, and Rav Herzog was the chief rabbi of Israel. The enactment was to recite Hallel without a bracha right after Shemona Esrei. Okay. But later on, Rav Goren changed it to reciting it with a bracha. And but then he went and changed his mind after that. Why? Because it seems to be was the really difficult thing, is determining for 100% that it is a miracle. So that was the struggle. And however, since that time, there's been a number of people who have felt that it needs to be a national holiday, and it has risen to that level in recent times. So the original enactment was struggling to do that. Now, does that mean it doesn't work? Well, no. The Gemara Megillah itself also records, we don't want a holiday of Purim. The Sanhedrin, we don't want this holiday. Why? The Goyim are going to hate us. They're going to hate the fact that we're celebrating our victory over them. We can't have this holiday. And they say, but, we should have this holiday. Why? Because it's hinted at in the Torah. Okay, so then the Sanhedrin goes, fine, we'll have this holiday. So the fact that Yom Haatzmaut is also shrouded in difficulty is not unfathomable. Does it mean that it's 100% slam dunk needs to be a holiday? No. However, my personal opinion is that one would recite Hallel with a bracha in the land of Israel because it has become an established custom for the country to have it as a full holiday. They take the day off, and there's a lot of celebrations are enacted on that day. One would say Hallel with a bracha, full Hallel, not half, and not this, not that, right? Because the main goal is to celebrate the fact that the Jewish people were able to have some national determination in the modern period, something that hadn't happened in thousands of years. However, outside the land of Israel, it becomes even more difficult to justify saying that because it's not an experience that happens in their country, and especially because a lot of people are against it. So it wouldn't be proper to go ahead and enact Hallel since we don't have a precedent for it. So we don't have precedent for it based on the words of the Chassam Sofer and other Ashkenazi rabbis that they were allowed to do that. And also, since there seems to have not been a lot of support for establishing new holidays in Sephardic lands, from what I could read, it will be difficult to hang your hat on that as well. I did see from Rabbi Ari Shvat, who pointed out that he himself says Hallel with a bracha, but that he recalls that Rabbi Soloveitchik did not say a Hallel with a bracha here in the United States. And so I'd like to wrap this up by saying that however it is that you wish to practice Yom Haatzmaut, it's always important to recognize the tremendous gifts that Hashem has given us, and that we continue to implore Him to provide us with more and more blessing, and that we see more and more gains and success in the land of Israel and all the places where the Jewish people live, and that everyone will be brought closer through our own commitment to Torah and mitzvos in order to do the right things, and to make a day that at one point people are arguing about whether it should be a holiday to become that it should be recognized that, yes, this truly is the greatest holiday that we've had in a long time. Thank you for joining. We will see you next time.